train station was filled with the low hum of announcements and distant whistles and people moving with purpose, but none of that noise could drown out the weight pressing on Hannah's chest as she stood in line, clutching her son's hand. And an old canvas purse that held all the money she had left for the week, which wasn't much, and definitely not enough to cover a ticket for both of them, but Noah had been asking her for weeks if they could ride the train just once, not to go somewhere far, just to feel it move and watch the world blur past the window and wave at people and pretend. They were going on a big adventure, and she had promised someday, hoping he would forget, or hoping that someday would magically arrive. But when he asked her again this morning with that innocent, hopeful face, she couldn't say no again, even though she knew in her heart it would end the same way as before, with disappointment wrapped in soft words and a forced smile and a promise she couldn't keep. But she brought him anyway, hoping maybe something would be different. Maybe the price had changed. Maybe she had miscounted. Maybe Miracle would show up in her pocket. So they stood there, and the closer they got to the counter, the more she could feel her hands shake, because hope is a dangerous thing. When you're poor, it plays tricks on your mind. It makes you believe in things you stopped believing in a long time ago. And when she reached the window and asked for 2 tickets, the woman behind the glass looked tired and bored and didn't even glance at her as she said the price and pointed to the sign. And Hannah began counting each coin, slowly, carefully, trying not to show the panic rising in her throat, as if the numbers refused to add up the way she needed them to, and her fingers trembled slightly as she laid the coins down one by one, silently begging them to stretch further than they could. And when the last coin clinked against the counter, she already knew what the result would be, but she still asked, "Is that enough?" And the woman barely looked up as she shook her head, said, "No, you're short." And Hannah's heart dropped, and she felt the tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly, because she couldn't cry in front of Noah, not now, not again. So she smiled a little too wide and said, "Okay, maybe next time," and turned around, ready to walk away, her pride dragging behind her like a broken wing. And Noah looked up, confused, and asked, "Aren't we going, Mama?" And she squeezed his hand tighter and whispered, "Maybe tomorrow, sweetie." But as she stepped away, a voice behind her said softly, "Wait, I'll pay for it." And she froze, because she wasn't expecting anyone to notice her, let alone help her, and she turned to see a man standing there in a simple jacket with warm eyes and a gentle face, and he held out his card toward the ticket lady and repeated, "I'll cover it, no problem." And Hannah's heart beat faster, not from gratitude but from shame, because she didn't want pity, didn't want her son to see her being rescued like that. So she shook her head quickly, said, "No thank you, we're fine," and tried to walk away. But the man said, "Please let me do this. It's not a big deal." And she snapped a little sharper. "I said, no thank you, we're fine." And with that she walked away and sat on the edge of the platform near the end, where there were fewer people, and pulled Noah onto her lap, hoping he would forget the train and be content just watching them go by. And he did for a while, pointing and clapping as the trains arrived and left. And she smiled at him, but inside she was screaming at herself, because she hated that her pride had stolen that moment from him, and hated that kindness from a stranger felt more like a slap than a gift. And she hated that the world made her choose between dignity and joy. And she closed her eyes and rocked her son gently and tried to let it go, but her mind wouldn't stop spinning, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking, in her chest wouldn't stop aching. And when she finally opened her eyes again, she saw the man still there across the platform, buying a coffee and looking in her direction, not staring, not prying, just looking like he was waiting for something. But then he turned away and walked out of sight, and she let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, and told herself it was for the best, because they didn't need anyone, they had each other, and they would find another way. And maybe someday she would have enough, and they would ride the train and buy snacks and laugh and take pictures, and she would give Noah everything he deserved. But as the minutes passed and the sun dipped lower in the sky and the trains kept coming and going, she started to feel the weight of that missed moment grow heavier, not because of the train, but because for a few seconds someone had looked at her like she mattered, and not like she was broken. And she realized she couldn't remember the last time she felt seen like that, and it scared her more than being invisible ever did. And when Noah fell asleep on her shoulder, she whispered stories into his ear about grand adventures on magical trains. and places with endless ice cream and soft beds and beaches with golden sand, and she promised him again that someday they would go, and this time she meant it even if she didn't know how, because something about that man's voice stayed with her, the softness of it, the steadiness, and the way he didn't make her feel small, even when she said no, and she wondered if she had made a mistake turning him down, because maybe kindness is rare, and maybe pride doesn't feed your child, and maybe letting someone help doesn't mean you're weak. Maybe it just means you're human, and she hated that it took this long to see that, but it was too late now, and the train had left, and so had he, and tomorrow would be just another day, and she would keep moving, keep trying, keep surviving like she always did, because that's what mothers do. They carry the world on their backs and still find a way to smile for their children and keep their dreams alive with lullabies and half-full plates and small promises wrapped in big love. And as the sky turned to dusk and the station emptied out, Hannah stood up slowly and carried her sleeping boy home step by step, with nothing in her pocket but the sound of a stranger's kindness echoing quietly in her heart. The morning after her silent walk home from the station, Hannah woke up early with aching arms from carrying Noah all the way back, and a tightness in her chest that made breathing feel heavier than usual as she stared at the ceiling of their tiny shared room, where cracks in the plaster formed crooked lines like maps to nowhere, and the wind outside whispered through the loose window panes. She listened to her son's peaceful breathing beside her, his little hand resting on her arm, and for a long moment she just lay there, unmoving, caught between exhaustion and the haunting echo of the stranger's voice from yesterday still lingering in her mind, as if it had been stitched into the fabric of her thoughts, and she couldn't forget the way he looked at her like she was more than a woman scraping through life. She couldn't forget the way he stepped forward without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to help, and she hated that she remembered all of it, and hated that she didn't know why it mattered so much. But as Noah stirred awake, rubbing his eyes and mumbling about trains again, she smiled despite herself and kissed the top of his head before sitting up slowly and deciding that maybe, just maybe, they could go back and watch the trains again, not to ask for anything, not to relive the moment, but just to let Noah have a piece of joy again, and maybe give herself the chance to understand what it was about, that man that unsettled her. So they walked hand in hand to the station with a small bag packed with crackers and water, and one old coloring book and a broken crayon, because she couldn't afford much else, but she still wanted Noah to feel like they were going on an adventure. And when they reached the platform, she chose the same bench at the far end where fewer people passed by, and she let him sit beside her, kicking his feet and pretending the trains were dragons roaring into magical cities. And for the first hour she felt calm, like maybe this was enough, like maybe she could find beauty in these small rituals and rebuild her strength in the laughter of her child, until she heard footsteps approach from the left, and she turned and saw him again. Same man, the stranger from yesterday, carrying 2 cups of coffee in a paper bag, and he stopped in front of her and said good morning like they were old friends, and asked if she minded him joining her, and she nodded slightly, unsure of what to say, and he sat beside her, not too close, not imposing, just present, and handed her one of the coffees and placed the paper bag beside Noah, who grinned when he saw it was filled with pastries, and the man chuckled softly and said, "Every explorer needs fuel for his imagination." And Hannah tried to say, "Thank you," but the words caught in her throat, and instead she whispered, "You didn't have to." And he replied quietly, "I know, but maybe I wanted to." And they sat in silence for a while, watching the trains come and go, while Noah munched happily and ran back and forth between the bench and the edge of the platform, counting cars and shouting out colors and train numbers, like he was the conductor of his own world. And for the first time in a long time, Hannah let herself breathe without guilt and without fear, because this man, whose name she still didn't know, wasn't asking anything of her, wasn't judging her, wasn't trying to fix her. He was just being there in the moment, and it was strange and unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. So she asked softly why he came back, and he said, "Maybe. I was hoping to see you again. Maybe I just like trains. Maybe a little of both." And when she looked at him, her eyes full of curiosity and uncertainty, he smiled and added, "My name's Daniel, by the way." And she replied, "Hannah." And that was all it took to shift something between them, because after that, the air felt different, warmer, like a window had opened and sunlight had reached in without either of them noticing, and they talked about ordinary things, books, Noah's favorite cartoons, the weather, and every time she looked at Daniel, she wondered what he saw in her, why he bothered, why he cared, and eventually she asked him what he did, and he hesitated for a moment before saying he used to run a company, but after his wife passed, he stepped away. He had been traveling around since then, trying to figure out what mattered, and Hannah didn't ask more because the sadness in his eyes was enough to tell her there was a story he wasn't ready to share, and she respected that, because she too had chapters she never wanted to open again. And so they continued their quiet ritual for several days, returning to the station every morning, sharing coffee and conversation and small laughter while Noah played and imagined, and each day felt a little lighter than the last. Until one afternoon when Noah tugged Daniel's hand and asked, "Can we go on the train today? Just a short ride, please?" And Daniel looked at Hannah and she hesitated again, the old resistance rising in her chest, but this time, she didn't say no, and she didn't pull away, because the look on her son's face was too bright, too dim, and Daniel didn't wait for her to ask. He simply walked to the counter, bought 3 tickets, and returned with a smile, and handed one to Noah like it was the key to the kingdom. And when they boarded the train and found seats by the window, the excitement in her son's eyes made her heart swell with something deeper than joy. It was gratitude and maybe even healing, and the train started, moving slowly at first, then faster, and Noah gasped at everything, the trees, the tunnels, the whistle, and she laughed more freely than she had in years, and Daniel just watched them with a kind of quiet contentment that said this was exactly where he needed to be. And as the train rolled on, Hannah asked him again why he did this, not just the ticket, but all of it, and he said, "My wife used to say, when you lose someone you love, don't run from the pain. Find someone else who's drowning and offer them your raft." And I didn't understand it then, but now I think I do. And when I saw you that day, I saw someone trying to keep her child afloat with nothing but her own strength, and it reminded me of the woman I lost because she was strong like that too. And Hannah couldn't respond right away because her throat was tight and her hands were trembling, and she didn't want to cry in front of her son or this man who was giving them so much with nothing in return. So she just nodded and whispered, "Thank you." And Daniel didn't say anything else. He just placed his hand gently over hers for a moment, and that one gesture said everything she needed to hear. And when the train reached the last stop near the coastline, they got off and walked to the edge of the beach and sat in the sand watching the waves crash against the rocks. And Noah chased seagulls while Daniel told stories about his travels, and for a while it felt like they were a family, and the idea scared her but also warmed her, because she had spent so long convincing herself she didn't need anyone, and now here was someone who didn't just see her but stood beside her without asking for anything. And when the sun began to set, they rode the train back in comfortable silence, Noah asleep across both their laps. And as they stepped off the platform, Daniel handed her a small folded note and said, "If you ever need anything, not just train rides or pastries, but someone to talk to or someone to listen, call me." And she took it and placed it in her bag. I'm sure if she would use it, but knowing it mattered. And when they parted ways that evening, and she walked home with Noah, snuggled close, she looked up at the sky and whispered a thank you to no one in particular, because sometimes the universe gives you strangers who feel like home. And she was beginning to wonder if Daniel was not a chance encounter, but the beginning of something her heart had been quietly waiting for all along. Asterisk. The morning air was crisp, with the scent of new rain clinging to the pavement and the sound of birds weaving songs between the hum of waking city life. As Hannah stood by the window of their small apartment, her fingers wrapped around the mug of lukewarm tea she had reheated 3 times while Noah still slept peacefully in the blanket fort they had built the night before in celebration of their train ride adventure, which had been the most magical day her son had ever lived. And for the first time in years, she had felt something shift deep inside her, something that began to soften the hard layers she had grown used to carrying like armor, because being strong was no longer just a survival skill. It had become her identity. And yet somehow Daniel's presence, his unwavering calm, his complete lack of expectations, and his quiet loyalty were chipping away at the walls she had built. And what terrified her most was not the idea of opening up, but the fear of what would be left of her if she let someone see how broken she really was, and he stayed anyway, because no one ever had before. And as she stared out at the wet street below, she found herself thinking about the note he had given her and the number she had memorized, even though she hadn't called it yet, because the idea of needing someone still clashed with every muscle in her body. But each day that passed made his absence feel more like a presence and less like a goodbye, and she hated that it mattered, and loved that it did. And when Noah stirred awake and called out for her, she wiped the corner of her eyes and went to him with a smile, ready to start another day. But that day did not unfold the way she expected, because as she made breakfast with the last of the bread and butter, there was a knock on the door, and for a moment she froze because no one ever came to visit, and she walked to the door cautiously, opened it slowly, and there stood Daniel, holding a paper bag in one hand and a soft, sheepish smile in the other, as he said, "I hope I'm not intruding. I was just in the neighborhood, and I thought maybe you and Noah would like some fresh bagels." And her first instinct was to close the door and hide behind the comfort of boundaries. But then she looked at his eyes and saw no pressure, no agenda, just simple kindness. And Noah ran past her, shouting. Daniel unwrapped himself around his leg like a puppy reunited with its favorite person, and that sight was so pure, so innocent, that she couldn't hold her resistance anymore. So she stepped aside and let him in. And he sat at the small chipped table that she had salvaged from a thrift store, while Noah climbed into his lap like he belonged there. And they ate together and laughed and talked, and she noticed how Daniel never once looked uncomfortable with their humble surroundings, never once made her feel like she had to apologize for her smallness. And after breakfast he offered to take them out for the day somewhere fun, and at first she said no, but then Noah looked at her with that same pleading spark in his eyes, and she gave in, and soon they were on the bus heading to a science museum where Noah spent hours running from exhibit to exhibit, asking 1,000 questions, and Daniel answered each one with such patience that it made her chest ache, because this man, who had no reason to stay, kept showing up and giving her son the kind of attention, love, and presence he had never known. And she watched them together, her heart slowly beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, something real could grow from this, something built not from rescue or charity, but from shared moments and respect. And when they sat together on a bench watching Noah try to build a robot out of foam pieces, Daniel looked at her and said, "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I care about you. And Noah, and I'd like to be around if that's okay." And she didn't answer right away because the words felt too big, and her fears too loud, but she nodded because something in her had already decided long ago, and he smiled in relief and squeezed her hand, and for the rest of the day they felt like something whole, like a tiny makeshift family dancing on the edge of a miracle. And for the next several weeks, Daniel became a constant part of their world, showing up every morning with fresh bread or a toy train or a book for Noah, and helping Hannah fix the broken drawer in her cabinet, and walking them to the park, and helping Noah with his letters and teaching him how to throw a ball. And never once did he try to take over or push too hard or change the rhythm of their lives. He just became a note in their melody, and they adjusted to it without even realizing. And one evening, after they had returned from a small picnic in the park, Daniel stayed back while Noah took a nap, and they sat on the couch watching the soft shadows dance across the floor. And he looked at her and said, "I want to tell you something." And she braced herself, because part of her was still waiting for the catch for the secret that would make him disappear like everyone else had. And he said, "I wasn't just in the neighborhood that day. I had been looking for you because the day you turned down my help, something about you stayed with me, and I couldn't stop thinking about you. And I asked the station manager if he knew your name or anything about you, and he didn't, but I kept coming back every morning hoping you would too. And when I saw you again, it felt like I had found something I didn't know I was missing." And Hannah didn't know what to say because her heart was racing, and her hands were trembling in all the memories of being left abandoned. Disappointed came rushing back like a flood, but Daniel gently took her hand and said, "I don't want anything from you. I just want to be here and build something together if you'll let me." And she whispered, "Why me?" And he replied, "Because you are strong and brave and honest, And because the way you love Noah is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And that night after he left, she sat in the dark, listening to Noah breathe and wondering how a stranger could become the one person who made her feel seen. And when she finally picked up her phone and called him just to say thank you, he answered on the first ring like he had been waiting. And over the next few months their bond grew, not through grand declarations or dramatic moments, but through the quiet dailiness of love, the way he held her hand when the world felt too heavy, the way he showed up without being asked the way. He gave her space and respect and choice, and one rainy afternoon, he stood by her side at the local bakery and introduced her to the owner as his partner, and she smiled and felt the truth of that word settle in her bones like it belonged. And one evening while Noah was at a sleepover, Daniel took her to the rooftop of a building where fairy lights hung from poles and soft music played from a speaker, and he cooked her dinner and told her he had been waiting a long time to find someone who understood both joy and pain the way she did. And under the stars he said, "I love you not with urgency or pressure but with reverence." And she said it back with tears in her eyes and her whole past trembling behind her voice. But for the first time, it didn't feel like weakness, it felt like courage. And a year later they stood together at the station, the same platform where it all began, watching Noah wave from the train window as they prepared for a family vacation. And as the train pulled away, Hannah turned to Daniel and said, "Do you remember the first time you saw me here?" And he nodded and he said, "I remember you whispering, 'Please, I can't afford this.' And I remember thinking that if I ever saw you again, I would make sure you never had to say those words again." And she kissed him and smiled, because in that moment she knew that sometimes the universe gives you pain just long enough to prepare your heart for something better. And now she stood beside a man who had become more than a rescuer, more than a partner. He had become her witness, her anchor, her home. And as the train carried their son toward the horizon, they both knew that life would still bring challenges and storms, but now they would face them together, not out of dependence, but out of shared strength and deep love. And from that day on, the station where she once walked away in shame became the place she returned to every year, not to remember the struggle, but to honor the beginning of the life she never thought she deserved, until a stranger reminded her that she did. Asterisk.